So I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think this year's South by was a bit more thoughtful than the others. So this was our second year, and this is us. And this guy here is quite important in this story. He's Henry, our adopted cab driver. One of the things about South by is that you can't get cabs. Halo, Uber don't work. You press them, nothing turns up. You stand almost in the desert, parched, waiting to be taken to the next tech talk. And so we met Henry and we said, pick us up at 9:30 every morning and take us home before we go out for beers. And so every day, Henry would ask us, you know, what have you seen? What's been big this year? And this shot was taken as we were leaving. You can tell Joe, one of our creative directors, looks like he's had an amazing time. And he said to us, not to Joe, because Joe was asleep, what did you think of this year? You know, how did it compare? And so I kind of thought back to last year. So that was last year. That was me and a couple of other guys from Karmarama in a non-pose shop looking for the future. And the future last year was really all about hardware. First talk last year, the replicator unveiled by Brie Pettis allows you to scan garden gnome type objects and reprint them in a 3D printer. Leap motion, who's still got a leap motion? I stood on this stage last year and said how amazing leap motions were. They're not at all. And then controversially, he says, wait, looking for the trapdoor, Google Glass. A really polarizing piece of technology, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute. So that was last year, and so kind of Henry said, so what about this year? And really, South by is now, as I said, South by used to be about app launches and software. So it was the place that launched Twitter, the place that launched Foursquare. Last year was kind of hardware, 3D printing, Internet of Things, the emergence of wearables. But there were big kind of tentpole things you could come back and talk about. So in terms of that one thing. Just like this man, we were slightly sad cowboys by the time we finished in Texas, because there wasn't that one thing we could kind of hang our hats on. But I think out of that kind of confusion really about technology, something really a bit darker, but a little bit more interesting appeared. In terms of where we are with technology, you all probably know this tech adoption curve. You start off down here with people in Shoreditch and go to South by, get very excited by products and services, and then something needs to happen to kick them over into the hump so normal people start to use them. And on the one side, you got 3D printing. This is a shot that my dad took at Sainsbury's in Staines. Next to the leisurewear, which I'm hoping my dad wasn't about to buy, there's a 3D printing magazine. So this time last year, 3D printing was not a sustainable enough microeconomy for a magazine to be produced. This year, I know plenty of people who are playing around with it. Those magazines are now starting to sell interestingly in printed format. They're not digital magazines; they are real magazines that sit on newsagent shelves. So there's a sense that although not everyone has got one, people are starting to play with it enough that a mainstream retailer will supply them. And the other thing about 3D printing is people are starting to use it for satire and comedy. So I went to a talk by an amazing kind of maker artist who, as a political comment, made these. These are Vladimir Putin 3D printed butt plugs, which again, I'm again hoping my dad doesn't get his hand on any of these, otherwise I'll be having some interesting conversations with him. So you can see that as technology moves into that phase, people start to do things with it, they start to kind of do comedy with it. And interestingly, Henry, as we started to talk about 3D printing, said, actually, I've got a side business. So as well as being a taxi driver, he runs a kind of maker workshop just outside Austin. And he takes old Games Workshop sort of RPG figures that are now out of production, and he takes them into the software and he makes them 10% smaller so as not to infringe copyright. And he prints them and he sells them on eBay for $50 rather than the original $5 that they cost. So 3D printing is, for the general public, becoming quite interesting. But as someone who's got to kind of go to Texas and come back with a future, it feels like there are interesting things you can do with it as brands, but in terms of what's happening next in technology and hardware, it was kind of a bit of a replay on last year. The other side of that equation for me at the moment is wearables. So Credit Suisse did a big report that they put out a couple of weeks ago trying to make sense of their kind of corporate investors about what the world of wearable tech will look like. And the 150 pages of that report failed to come to any conclusion other than there'll be a lot of them. And there's no sense that there's one kind of form factor. which is understandable because a lot of them are based on utility. But again, as people are trying to understand what the general public can do with these, there was an awful lot of debate around these types of technologies, whether they're good for humanity, which ones are going to be used, and a lot of kind of dissenting voices. Now we'll bring this guy back up again. This was one of the most tweeted images at South by, and I kind of coined the name of this guy and called him the triple tech twat. And it was the most retweeted tweet I've ever written and probably ever will read. So this guy was going along the streets in Austin on a Segway, texting using Google Glass. And again, controversially in this building, although Google Glass looks like it could be used for lots of amazing things, the rise of the glass hole and Google's kind of counter against that, telling people how they should and shouldn't use it, it feels like this piece of technology is going to struggle to be the kind of the ruling bit of wearable tech, although it does have its uses. Now this is quite interesting. It builds on the T-shirt OS that Anjali talked about, made by a company called Cute Circuit, who are based in Shoreditch. So they were talking about how fashion has been kind of quite almost allergic to technology for a long time. They'll use technology in their manufacturing processes, but technology and fashion have been quite uneasy bedfellows. So they've now started to take LED panels and kind of pressure pads into some of the higher end pieces of fashion they make that allow you to react to other people wearing the same dresses or react to what people on Twitter are saying about you. Again, interesting and very interesting in terms of how technology is being used as a way to kind of broadcast yourself on clothes, but as a kind of a big all-round use case, it's a struggle to see how that's going to kind of be massively adopted. What was really interesting though is I kind of expected everyone to be talking about the future of wearables or the immediate impact of wearables to be around these things. So this is the new Fitbit. Went to a series of talks, again, IDEO and MIT, who generally do the most informed talks over at South by. And the guy from IDEO said, look, if I asked people in the audience to put their hands up who has owned one of these health tracking pieces of hardware, 3/4 of the room would put their hand up, and he did it, and we all did. And then he said, how many of you 3 months on are still using those products? And pretty much everyone put their hands down, apart from, bizarrely, a very, very unfit looking guy at the back who was wearing 6 of them, who was obviously some sort of weird Fitbit fanboy. And he came on to quite an interesting point, which is quite nicely dealt with by what Dan showed with the new product from Mother, is the problem with a lot of these products and the problem with a lot of wearables is this. So those of you in agencies who've got analytics people, they're the types of people that get excited by this, about how far have I run, how do I compare against my last run last week, how do I compare against how other people have performed. And this is anecdotally from talking to people at Nike, they're kind of, although Nike Plus has done and the Fuel Band has done an amazing job for them as a brand, the actual number of people using it to get usable data out from it is fairly small. And that's because none of this is really linked to behavioural science. So a couple of really interesting talks from a fitness brand and a personal trainer talking about when you go to the gym, the person who motivates you to do stuff is a personal trainer because they've got that human insight. And until we build a behavioural layer on top of this data that's influenced either by very good AI or a human being to tailor it a bit like where Mother's going, the future of wearables is probably not fitness. So at this point, it's all getting a little bit confusing. Android Wear announced, sort of teased by Google at South by, announced now LG are bringing out their watch in July for $180. You can see that these might be a bit more mainstream than some of the other things we've spoken about. But again, a couple of the analysts who talked about this as a kind of sector within wearable was advising people not to bet their mortgage on everyone having these. And I guess the real problem of wearables was summed up by this talk. So halfway through, look down the massive program of talks you can go to South by, and this pops up, future of wearables. I'm like, I'm in, I'm off. I'm going to come back. It's all going to be good. It consisted of 2 Japanese guys, these 2 guys here, who were clearly very bright, worked in engineering for Sony and then set off to do their own thing. They couldn't speak English. They had a translator with them. And they showed a 30-second video of a close-up of an eyeball. And there was the close-up of the eyeball lasted for 30 seconds and nothing really happened, and we were all shifting on our seats a little bit uncomfortably. And then another eyeball appeared, and the two eyeballs looked at each other, and a string of data went between them. And I thought, this is looking quite interesting. And then the video stopped, and then the guy said, so that's my product. And we were all dreadfully confused. So we asked some questions like, what is your product? He said, it's Google Glass without the glass. And we were like, this is amazing. And he then said, I haven't actually built the product, and it's not usable, and I can't talk about it because I've just been given $10 million of seed funding. And that, for me, is kind of where all of this comes to, is there's all sorts of people releasing products, trying to bet on the future, right from very big organisations like Google to traditional ones like Nike and traditional form factors with the watch. And then there's guys like this who are coming up with ideas that don't really exist and getting a huge amount of money. So there was this kind of counter argument that actually maybe we should wait for these things. So this is an example of an ingestible. So I got halfway through South by and realised wearables were actually very last year, and this year was all about ingestibles. And this was one of the more easy and less scary to understand. So these tiny pills have a very, very small dissolvable chip in them. And you swallow them, and then that chip talks to your iPhone app, and it tells you whether you've taken the pill. It measures your heart rate. It will measure your blood glucose levels. If you're diabetic, that's incredibly important. It will look to see whether you're wearing a pacemaker and see whether that pacemaker is calibrated properly. So there's a whole series of arguments that were being made in some of the lectures I went to on wearables, that until we accept technology into our bodies physically and start to become towards the land of the cyborgs, that wearing appendages is not going to get us very far. And I thought, this is all starting to sound incredibly science fiction. And the next talk I went to, and I'm really chuffed I get to talk about this man on stage, this guy's called Warren Ellis. Any sci-fi or comic geeks in the room will know him, which means that's just me. But he did a really interesting talk, again with the guys from MIT, talking about the relationship between science fiction and technology. And he said, and I'll show you an example of it in a minute, 25 years ago, I could sit down, I could imagine the piece of technology, I could write it in a book, I could publish it, and 1% of it would come true, and everyone would say, you can see the future and buy me lots of beer. And now, he basically said, I think sci-fi's fucked. You turn Sky on, Game of Thrones is on, which is far more detailed engineering of what I can imagine. You start writing a book about a piece of technology that you've just about heard of. By the time you finish the book and it's published, they're selling it in Walmart. And what's interesting about him is that in 1997, he wrote a comic called Transmetropolitan, which starred this guy over here who's hitting this guy, called Spider Jerusalem. Spider Jerusalem used to live on a mountain meditating until he was called back by this guy who's his editor to come back to this fictitious city that's a bit like New York to save it from a corrupt politician. So he comes back down from the mountain, and he's given a series of bits of technology that, bearing in mind this was written in 1997, will seem eerily familiar. He gets given a pair of glasses that allow him to navigate his way around the city and record conversations he's having with people. He arrives back at his flat totally naked for some reason, and he has a box which looks a bit like a 3D printer, which prints all of his food and his guns and his clothes. And he kind of ends up representing various groups in this fictitious city who've all been afflicted by illnesses or viruses caused by technology. So who represents people who've decided to implant microchips in their brain and they've gone mad, or people who've done experiments and turned into animals. And it's a little bit of a parable about technology, which when you think about it was written nearly 20 years ago is quite scary. And where I think science fiction has still got something to tell us about technology is when you start to think about all this technology we've heard about in the last hour or so, that whether it's the data people own about us or it's physical technology we're going to put into our bodies, there's still this massive issue about whose vision of the future you trust. Now, it's pretty easy to fall on the side of Edward Snowden versus the NSA and GCHQ. We'd all agree that he's kind of the good guy and the rest of them are bad guys. But when you come on to look at more complex things, Nigel's already talked about Eric Schmidt. Google have some great aspirations for their vision of the world, democratizing internet access, protecting Iranian protesters, but they also own more data about us than anyone else. 23andMe, lady who runs that, did the keynote basically, if you give her company $100 and you spit in a test tube, 2 weeks later they will tell you who your real father is, your genetic makeup, and what diseases you might suffer from in the future, which is really interesting until you think about what happens if that data falls into the hands of insurance companies, and until you remember that she was married to Sergey Brin, who set Google up. So there's a little bit of a theme coming in. Or Secret, which is probably the closest app to a big app we had this year, allows you to anonymously talk to the people in your phone book. And on the face of it, you think that's great. The problem is loads of VCs in the States are refusing to fund Secret beyond its original founding because it's being used for bullying and being used for people to leak secrets, false secrets about Silicon Valley companies. And the guy who presented, the guy who owns the company presented, and he said two interesting things. Firstly, he used to work for Google and is funded by Google. And secondly, although it's anonymous, you're not untraceable. Mark Zuckerberg, who again has got a very clear vision for the internet, which mostly involves sending me belly fat ads, which may or may not tell you something about me, but also wants to put drones around the world and give universal internet access. So there's this real sense of all of these people, back to kind of Nigel's point, there's a real sense of utopia at South by, but I think this year the collision of all of these technologies that have gone almost beyond sci-fi starts to get a bit interesting when you think about the group of people who are behind them and potentially, even in a benign way, what they might do with our data. And then you see Tim Berners-Lee almost cutting a disconsolate figure as he stands up and goes, I invented this thing, this reason why you're all here 25 years ago, and I want to launch the Magna Carta for the web and I want it back. And you kind of want to pat him on the shoulder and get him to sit down and say it's kind of already gone and these people are in charge. So there's this massive kind of counterplay against an undercurrent against the search for all of this new technology. But if you think that sounds very confusing and you're becoming a bit of a sad cowboy like this guy, what I would say is South by is an amazing experience, and it kind of really prompts you to think about the underlying currents of the technology that we get very excited about. And as a final note, I'd like to show you what happens if you decide not to go to South by and you decide to go to social media marketing week, which was about the week before or the week after, and you're sat in an auditorium a little bit like this, and someone comes on stage and sings this song. If you could play the video.
Showing you things you like, try to get engagement with some photos from my life, my cat, my kids, some bacon. I'm hoping you'll share my stuff and tweet it to the world if you help me grow my clouds. I promise that I'll share yours, so connect with me, let's have some fun. Show the world how this gets done. Let's get social with social media. Let's get social with social media, where we can spread the word and grow our reach and find our fans in their news feed. Let's get social with social media.
Thank you very much.